In the sweltering summer of 1847, 13 members of the wealthy Bogard family perished within hours inside their Garden District mansion in New Orleans. Official records buried in the Louisiana State Archives list the cause as sudden fever. But the physician who attended them, Dr. Armand Tobito, wrote in his private journal that he had never seen such synchronized suffering. The family's fingernails blackened their tongues, swelled purple, and their screams carried through the halls until dawn. Each death occurred precisely 90 minutes after the family's traditional Sunday supper, and the only survivor was Violet, the head cook. For over 170 years, this mystery has remained hidden beneath silence, fear, and shame. But tonight, we revisit what really happened in that kitchen and why an entire bloodline vanished in a single evening. The seeds of that tragedy were planted years before poison ever touched a plate rooted in cruelty that demanded retribution. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of glittering wealth and brutal oppression, where mansions of Greek revival grandeur loomed over lives built on slavery. The Bogard mansion was among the district's finest, with towering Corinthian columns and a reputation for excess. Octave Bogard, who inherited the estate and a vast sugar plantation, ruled both household and slaves with an iron hand. His wife Celeste, from a proud Creole family, tolerated his cruelty to preserve her social standing. Their children, Etienne 19, Margot 17, Philippe 15, and little Amalie just 8, were raised to see enslaved people as no more than property. Living under the same roof were Octave's brother Auguste, his wife Lucille, their twin sons Henri and Louis, along with Octave's mother, Grandmère Bogard, still formidable at 78, and Celeste's sharp-tongued sister, Tante Félicité. Behind the walls of privilege lived 26 enslaved people, their bodies and spirits scarred by bondage. Violet, the head cook, carried the heaviest burden. Born in the quarters in 1823, she inherited the kitchen after her mother Essie died of exhaustion. From her teenage years, she fed the very family that enslaved her, developing a gift in the kitchen so refined that New Orleans society praised the Bogards for their feasts. Yet behind the elegance lay Violet's relentless toil. 18-hour days, a bare room with only a straw mattress and a wooden cross from her mother, and the crushing knowledge that her extraordinary skills chained her tighter to the family that owned her. As head cook, Violet carried the crushing responsibility of upholding the Bogard family's reputation for hosting the finest dinners in the Garden District. Yet she was forbidden from tasting the food she prepared, forced instead to rely on sight, smell, and instinct alone. She could tell the thickness of a sauce by how it clung to a spoon, judge the doneness of a roast by its aroma, and know the sweetness of a dessert by intuition. Octave Bogard relished this cruelty, often reminding her that while she created meals fit for kings, she herself would eat only scraps. Among the enslaved, Violet was both admired and pitied. She earned a measure of respect for her skill and the privileges her role afforded. She was spared the whip, spared the cane fields, sometimes even gifted worn dresses from the women of the house. But her life was one of isolation. Endless hours in the kitchen left little room for companionship, and her position separated her from the fragile moments of solidarity that gave others the strength to endure. Still, there were bonds. Samuel, the stablemaster's son, had caught her eye despite the danger. At 28, with a quiet strength about him, he shared with Violet stolen glances and whispered words in the midnight kitchen. Their affection grew into love, though both knew love was a perilous luxury. Samuel dreamed of buying their freedom, but such dreams were impossible when his labor could bring Octave $50 a year in profit. Then there was Moses, the aging butler, who had served the family for over 40 years. Bent with age but sharp in spirit, he seemed to know the family's desires before they spoke them, offering wine at the precise moment it was wanted, or disappearing when discretion was required. Society praised his loyalty, but his eyes revealed a different truth. A cold fire smoldering beneath decades of forced obedience. Young Lily, barely 16, lived in constant dread as Celeste's maid. Her beauty drew dangerous attention, and she moved like a shadow through the halls, silent and cautious, desperate to avoid notice. In the stables, Samuel's father Thomas carried the wisdom of survival. A man who had buried 2 wives and endured 3 masters. His face trained never to betray what he truly thought. Life in the mansion followed a rigid rhythm. Breakfast at 7, luncheon at 1, always staged with the elegance demanded of a family so high in society. But Sunday supper was their true ritual, the jewel of the week. At 5:30, cocktails in the parlor. At 6, Moses announced the meal as if presiding over a mass. Under the Parisian chandelier, the Bogards gathered at the long table laid with china and crystal, each seat fixed in a hierarchy that had never changed. Even in her 70s, Grandmère Bogard sat at Octave's right, while his brother Auguste occupied the left. Conversation unfolded as carefully as the courses: soup, fish, fowl, vegetables, roasts, and finally, the elaborate desserts that cemented Violet's reputation. Yet beneath this veneer of harmony, trouble was brewing. A poor sugar crop and flooding had left the family in debt. Creditors pressed hard, and Octave, already cruel, became increasingly volatile. His temper was sudden and violent, his eyes cold with calculation. Whispers of selling off slaves circulated through the household, spreading fear. Amid this growing tension, Violet's secret bond with Samuel deepened. Then, on a suffocating June afternoon in 1847, as Violet prepared delicate canapes for a dinner party honoring visiting Charleston plantation owners, she heard Samuel's voice outside. Raised in alarm, raw with distress. Rushing to the window, she saw a scene in the courtyard that would alter the course of her life and seal the fate of the Bogard family forever. Samuel knelt in the dusty courtyard, his shirt torn and bloodied, while Octave loomed over him, whip in hand, his face twisted with rage. Spittle flew from his lips as he shouted, "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes!" "You forget your place, boy." Violet froze at the kitchen window, her blood running cold. She had seen the way 17-year-old Margot flushed when Samuel was near, and she had noticed Samuel's unease at the girl's unwanted attention. But in the twisted logic of slavery, a man's discomfort was twisted into presumption, and presumption was a crime that could mean death. "Please, Master Bogard." Samuel gasped, his words breaking between blows. "I would never—" His plea was cut short by the crack of leather. Silence. Your guilt is written in your silence. When Octave raised the whip again, Violet could no longer stand by. She burst from the kitchen door and threw herself over Samuel's bleeding back. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "He's done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard." Octave's fury shifted into something more dangerous, calm, cold calculation. His voice dropped to a whisper. "So, the cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." The other slaves shrank back instinctively, sensing disaster. Violet's knees shook, but she didn't move. "No, Master, You only," what he cut her off, stepping close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath. "You think because you cook a decent meal, you can question me?" The silence was suffocating. Samuel's ragged breathing and the call of a mockingbird were the only sounds. Violet knew she had crossed a line that could never be erased, but she stood her ground. "Samuel is a good man," she said again, her voice firm. Octave laughed, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "A good man. He's property, my property. And so are you." Then leaning close, he whispered, "I think you've forgotten that." The punishment that followed was meant to break them both. Samuel was locked in the tack room without food or water, left to rot until he learned respect. But for Violet, Octave devised a cruelty that cut deeper than any lash. She was to prepare every meal, as always, yet she would not eat until each family member declared themselves satisfied. "And since I am very difficult to satisfy," he sneered, "you may be waiting a long time." The next 3 days were hell. Violet cooked feasts she couldn't touch, surviving only on water and the scraps Moses or Lily dared sneak to her. Her hands trembled as she kneaded dough. Her vision swam as she stirred sauces. Her legs nearly gave out as she carried platters to the dining room. Octave found fault with every dish: the soup too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables overcooked, and each complaint meant another day without food. He reveled in describing every bite while Violet stood by hollow-eyed, forced to watch. On the second day, Samuel escaped his prison, staggering toward the kitchen in desperation. He made it only a few yards before Octave's men seized him. The beating was so brutal that Dr. Thibodeau was summoned to ensure Samuel didn't die too soon. As Thibodeau cleaned Samuel's wounds, he noticed Violet hovering nearby, her face gaunt with hunger, but her eyes fierce with something that unsettled him. Later, he confided to his wife, "That girl has the look of someone who has been pushed past the breaking point. I've seen it before. It's dangerous." Thibodeau, a physician who lived between worlds, serving the wealthy families, yet secretly tending to slaves, when conscience demanded, recognized the warning signs. A delicate balance held plantation life together. But when that balance broke, the consequences were always catastrophic. Dr. Thibodeau had seen enough cruelty in his career to know its effects. Most souls, when broken by relentless suffering, simply became shells, moving through life without spirit. But a rare few hardened instead, transforming pain into purpose. These were the ones who learned to wait, to endure, to plan revenge with cold patience. As Thibodeau watched Violet tend Samuel's wounds, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, he recognized that dangerous shift. He even considered warning Octave that his cruelty was courting disaster. But like many unspoken cautions, the thought was put off until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet shifted. As she stood in the dining room, swaying from hunger, watching Octave savor her praline bread pudding with smug delight, a fog of clarity settled over her. She began noticing details she had once overlooked: Octave's trembling hands, betraying the weight of his financial troubles, Celeste's furtive glances at the brandy decanter, Philippe's unsettling interest in Lily, and the small but telling routines of every member of the household. Grand-mère's medicine 30 minutes before meals, Auguste's compulsive watch-checking, little Amelie's habit of saving her favorite foods for last. What had once been part of her duties now became pieces of a puzzle. She no longer saw her oppressors as untouchable figures, but as a system she could dismantle. That night, after Octave finally declared himself satisfied enough to end her starvation, Violet collapsed onto her straw mattress with a decision burning in her mind. She would continue to serve the Bogards, but not in the way they expected. Her plan would not be the product of rage, but of precision. The same care she put into her finest meals, the same patience she had cultivated through years of endurance. She would wait for the perfect moment, and then she would serve a supper they would never forget. By July, Violet's outward behavior suggested submission. She worked with her usual efficiency, wore her mask of obedience, and gave no outward sign of rebellion. To the Bogards, she appeared broken, restored to her place. But those who knew her best saw the change. Moses, ever observant, noticed that her movements had lost their warmth and fluidity, replaced by an almost mechanical precision. Her instincts in the kitchen seemed sharper, unnatural, as though her senses had become weapons. Samuel, still battered from his beating, watched her with growing unease. The woman he loved had once carried warmth in her laughter, light in her touch. Now, when she came to him in the pre-dawn hours to tend his wounds, her hands were still gentle, but her eyes were cold, fixed, reptilian. One morning he finally whispered, "Violet, you're scaring me. What's going on in that head of yours?" She paused in the doorway, framed by the pale light. Turning back, her face unreadable, she said softly, "I'm going to take care of everything. You don't need to worry anymore." Samuel's heart sank. "What do you mean, take care of everything?" But she was already gone, leaving him with the chilling certainty that Violet's resolve was no longer just about survival. It was about ending it all, no matter the cost. The Bogard family, blind to nuance, mistook Violet's transformation for proof that Octave's cruelty had put her back in her place. They praised her meals more than ever, marveling at their artistry, never realizing that her new precision masked something far darker. What they interpreted as dedication was in truth research. On her trips to the French market, Violet still selected the finest ingredients, but she also slipped into the stalls, hidden in its shadows. There, herb women and root doctors whispered knowledge passed down from African, Caribbean, and native traditions. In New Orleans of 1847, medicine and magic blurred. What healed in small doses could kill in larger ones. Violet never asked direct questions. She let conversations flow casually, her sharp mind collecting every fragment of forbidden knowledge. She learned which roots twisted stomachs into knots, which mushrooms mimicked fevers, which combinations of herbs baffled even experienced doctors. Her most valuable teacher was Mama Brigitte, a mysterious Creole woman said to be nearly a century old, her age as much a legend as her wisdom. Born free in Haiti before the revolution, she had carried across the Gulf a knowledge of plants that made her stall a place of quiet pilgrimage. To Violet, she gave more than recipes. She gave power. "This root eases the stomach if you use a little," she explained, pressing bark into Violet's hand. "But too much, and it brings death quick." She taught her the subtleties of timing, dosage, and weight. The difference between a tonic and a poison lay only in the hand that prepared it. Back in the kitchen, Violet's craft evolved into something far more dangerous. She began experimenting in whispers, pinches of root in August's stew that left him clutching his belly, a trace of bitter herb in Philippe's meal that made him pale and queasy, delicate additions so slight that they went unnoticed except in their effects. The family dismissed every symptom as summer's toll. Celeste's stomach pains were blamed on the heat. Dr. Thibodeau prescribed a tonic and urged moderation. Little Amelie's listlessness was brushed off as a child's weakness in the Louisiana humidity. No one saw the pattern. Among the enslaved, however, change was harder to ignore. Violet, once a figure of quiet strength, began to pull away. She had always been somewhat apart due to her station, but now even Lily's whispered confidences met with polite deflections, and Moses's fatherly presence was held at bay. To Thomas Samuel's father, there was something dangerous in her silence, like a hound waiting for the command to strike. Samuel alone tried to breach her walls, but even with him, she guarded herself. One August night, they sat together in the small garden behind the quarter cicadas, buzzing in the heavy air. "You're changing, Violet," he whispered, watching her profile against the stars. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize." For a moment, her mask slipped, and the fury beneath showed through. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying a weight that chilled him. "They took everything from me." It was then Samuel realized the truth. Violet was no longer living only to endure. She was preparing to make the Bogards choke on the life they had stolen from her. Violet's quiet words chilled Samuel more than any scream could. "My mama, my childhood, my freedom, and when I finally found something worth caring about, when I found you, They took that too. They beat you like an animal and made me watch. They starved me for their amusement. Samuel reached for her hand, desperate to pull her back from the edge, but she withdrew. That don't mean you got to become like them, he pleaded. Her answer was like ice. I'm not becoming like them. They destroy because it brings them pleasure. I'm going to destroy because it must be done. When he pressed her, "What are you planning?" her eyes held a terrifying calm, a serenity born not of forgiveness, but of resolve. I'm going to serve them exactly what they deserve. Nothing more, nothing less. As summer gave way to early fall, Violet's preparations reached their final stage. She had gathered the knowledge, tested the subtleties, and memorized the family's every weakness until their lives were as predictable as a recipe. All that remained was the moment. It arrived with Octave's announcement of a grand Sunday supper in late September, a feast to celebrate the sugar harvest that had pulled the family back from financial ruin. It would be more than a meal. It would be a declaration of victory with creditors paid, and Octave once again strutting as a master of fortune. To mark the occasion, he invited New Orleans' most powerful judges, bankers, merchants, even the mayor himself. 23 honored guests would sit alongside the 13 Bogards beneath the glittering chandelier. For Violet, it was perfect. Octave, in his arrogance, decreed that every house slave remain on duty that evening, ensuring the entire household master's guests and servants would be present when the reckoning came. Violet's focus sharpened into something inhuman. At the French market, she inspected every ingredient with obsessive care, the ripeness of tomatoes, the marbling of meats, the strength of herbs. Her menu was dazzling, a triumph of Creole cuisine designed to showcase her genius. It would begin with turtle soup spiced to sharpen the appetite, followed by pompano in a sauce of impossible delicacy. Then squab stuffed with a family recipe Violet had twisted into something new and dangerous. Roasted beef and pork would follow with vegetables and breads prepared to perfection. And for the finale, the masterpiece for which she was famed, her mother's bread pudding with pralines and custard. The dessert whispered about in every New Orleans salon. Only this time, the secret ingredient was not love or legacy, but vengeance. On Friday, she visited Mama Brigitte one last time. The ancient woman, older than memory, wrapped the final herbs in brown paper with a heavy sigh. "You sure about this path, child? Once you start down it, there's no turning back." Violet met her gaze without hesitation. "I've already gone too far. They made sure of that." Brigitte handed her the bundle with a whisper, like a benediction and a curse. "Then may God have mercy on all your souls, because you won't find it anywhere else." That weekend, the kitchen became her sanctuary and her altar. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture exact, as if she were assembling not a meal, but a ceremony. She no longer hummed as she worked. Silence hung around her like smoke pressing on anyone who dared step too close. Samuel, limping but able to move again, found excuses to check on her, his heart tight with dread. What he saw frightened him more than Octave's whip ever had. Violet's face was expressionless, her hands precise, her eyes focused with a cold artistry that bore no trace of the joy she once found in her craft. Watching her, Samuel realized the truth. This was no longer cooking. This was the careful construction of a final judgment. On Saturday night, with the kitchen quiet and the knives gleaming under her steady hands, Samuel could no longer hold back. He stepped close, his voice barely more than a plea. "Violet, I'm begging you, don't do this. We'll find another way." She paused, her hand stilling on the blade, but she didn't look at him. Another way to what Samuel freedom justice? Her eyes finally met his, sharp and unflinching. "You think there's justice for people like us? You think if we just wait, pray, or work harder, Someone will set things right. Samuel's throat tightened. If you do what you're planning, you'll destroy yourself along with them. Violet laid the knife aside, her voice flat. I've already been destroyed. The only choice left is whether I die alone or whether they die with me. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of the woman Samuel loved crossed her face, a shadow of softness quickly gone. If you love me, she whispered, you'll find a way not to be here tomorrow night. His heart sank. Dear God, Violet, what have you done? But she had already turned back to her work, and he knew the answer had been written long ago in the courtyard under the whip, when something inside her had died forever. Sunday, October 3rd, 1847. Dawned clear and cool, the air carrying the first hint of autumn. The Bogard mansion stirred before sunrise, preparing for what would be the grandest social event of the season. Violet rose as she always had, tying on her white apron and head wrap. But when she caught her reflection in the shard of mirror above her straw bed, the face staring back was hollow-cheeked calm in a way that seemed almost unearthly. She studied it for a moment, then turned away to begin the most important work of her life. The kitchen became a storm of orchestrated chaos under her control. Unlike other feasts where she delegated tasks today, Violet guarded every critical step. She alone mixed the sauces, measured the seasonings, and prepared the most delicate courses. Moses, moving between dining room and kitchen, noticed her uncanny alertness. She seemed to know where every person in the house was at any given moment, pausing whenever footsteps echoed nearby, tilting her head as though she could map the household's movements by sound alone. Girl's got ears like a cat today, he muttered to Lily as they polished silver. Lily, distracted and nervous, only nodded. Neither realized Violet wasn't just working, she was synchronizing. Timing was everything. By noon, the mansion had been transformed. Flowers brightened every parlor, crystal glittered beneath chandeliers, and the dining table gleamed with imported china from Limoges, set on flawless Irish linen. Silverware caught the light like scattered stars. Upstairs, Celeste sat for hours, while Lily twisted her hair into an elaborate crown of pins and pomade. Grand-mère Bogard insisted on donning her finest black silk and heirloom emeralds. The men gathered in Octave's study, brandy in hand, boasting about harvest profits and politics in Washington. August was in high spirits, flushed with pride at the family's recovery. The children dressed in new finery, Philippe, Henri, and Louis in stiff suits, little Emily in her pristine white dress, were drilled on their manners to be admired but never interrupt. By late afternoon, the first guests arrived. Judge Dufresne and his wife were followed by banker Blanchard and his elegant daughter Celestine, whispered about as one of New Orleans' most eligible. Dr. Thibodeau arrived with his medical bag, hoping it would stay closed for once. When Mayor Chouteau's carriage rolled up, the household buzzed with excitement. His booming congratulations and florid speeches about Louisiana's bright future filled the hall as Octave basked in his triumph. To the gathered elite, it was a night of celebration of wealth and power displayed at its finest. But in the kitchen, Violet moved like a figure of ritual. Her silence heavy, her precision absolute. To the guests, the feast would be a masterpiece. To Violet, it was a reckoning. As the guests arrived in their glittering carriages and the mansion swelled with laughter, perfume, and the rustle of fine silks, Violet moved with the precision of a surgeon. The chaos of hospitality had created the opening she had been waiting for. While the household staff busied themselves with coats, wine, and greetings, she made her final adjustments to the feast. Each addition was small, measured to the grain, chosen not only for its potency, but for how it would mingle with the body of the one who consumed it. A pinch in the soup, a dusting in the sauces, a hidden note in the stuffing, every element designed to work not alone, but together. Individually, the amounts were harmless, barely noticeable if examined. But Violet understood timing and accumulation better than anyone. These were not dishes, they were instruments in a symphony of slow ruin, their effects layered and calibrated to rise in unison. By 6 o'clock, the parlor was alive with chatter glasses raised high. Octave presided at the center of it all, laughing too loudly, his voice thick with pride. He basked in the glow of his guests' admiration, speaking of harvest triumphs and New Orleans' bright future. The air shimmered with the arrogance of power, and from the kitchen doorway, Violet drank it in like bitter wine. Every face before her represented the world that had crushed her mother, broken Samuel, and stripped her bare. Tonight, they would all feast on her artistry. Tonight, her reckoning would be served. When Moses stepped into the parlor and bowed, announcing that supper was served, the company rose with practiced elegance. Octave led the way, with the mayor on his arm. Celeste followed with Judge Dufresne, and the rest filed in according to rank and custom. Grand-mère, draped in black silk and emeralds, leaned on Etienne's arm, savoring the attention. The procession was solemn, almost ritualistic, as though they were priests approaching an altar. The dining room glittered under dozens of candles, every surface shimmering with light. The Bogard china and crystal gleamed against pristine linen, each place setting a symbol of wealth and legacy. The scent of Violet's cooking filled the air, rich and tantalizing, setting mouths watering before the first plate even touched the table. Guests murmured with delight, their anticipation sharpened by Octave's boasts that this would be the finest supper in New Orleans. Even Dr. Thibodeau, who had dined in Paris salons, found himself eager to taste what the city's whispers had elevated to legend. Violet stayed to the shadows, directing the servants with her usual quiet authority. But where once she had taken pride in presenting each dish tonight, she remained apart, her eyes detached, watching as though the diners were specimens in an experiment. The first course arrived, turtle soup, rich, delicate, and aromatic. Spoons dipped, smiles spread, and voices rose in praise. Judge Dufresne called it a triumph of the culinary arts banker. Blanchard declared it finer than anything in Paris, and even Grand-mère Bogard, known for her biting tongue, gave a satisfied nod. The family basked in the compliments, unaware that the true brilliance of the dish lay not in its flavor, but in the first invisible note of a deadly harmony Violet had composed. The feast had begun, and with it the slow unfolding of Violet's plan. The poisons Violet had chosen moved like shadows through the bloodstream, slow, subtle, cumulative. With each course, the effects deepened unnoticed by all but her watchful eyes. The pompano praise to the heavens by Mayor Shuto carried another measured layer of her design. He laughed, declared it a dish worthy of Olympus, and demanded the recipe, while Octave, swelling with pride, promised it on her behalf. The wine flowed, tongues loosened, and the dining room rang with laughter and toasts. But beneath the glitter and chatter, Violet saw the first cracks forming. August's appetite faltered, though he continued to compliment every dish. Celeste pressed a hand discreetly against her stomach. Young Philippe flushed redder than the wine in his glass. None of it was enough to stir suspicion yet. The beef and pork were paraded in with grandeur, drawing gasps of admiration. The guests marveled at the flavors. But Dr. Thibodeau, scanning the table with a physician's eye, noticed details others missed. Grand-mère Bogard struggled with her swallow. Henry sweated more heavily than the warmth of the room justified. Banker Blanchard's booming conversation now came with effort, his words slightly slurred with fatigue. Thibodeau made quiet notes in his mind, but dismissed them as the harmless effects of indulgence wine and Louisiana heat. Then came the finale. Violet's bread pudding crowned with pralines and drenched in custard. A dish that had secured her reputation in every corner of New Orleans society. Tonight it carried not only her mother's legacy, but the final note of Violet's deadly symphony. The guests swooned over it. Mayor Shuto declared it the best dessert in Louisiana. Judge Dufresne insisted Violet should be serving royalty. Octave basked in their praise, raising his glass to toast the finest cook in all Louisiana, never knowing how prophetic his words would become. The applause faded into silence as August mid-story faltered. His hand shot to his throat, his face twisted in pain. I feel he choked, the words dying on his tongue. Celeste dropped her silk fan, her hands trembling violently, the color draining from her face. Dr. Thibodeau rose, alarmed. Something's wrong. But before he could finish, his own stomach clenched, and he realized with horror it was already too late. Panic swept the room. Groaning, gasping, clawing for breath. What began as discomfort became terror. Gros Bogard collapsed, her frail body giving out as crystals shattered across the table. Little Amélie sobbed for her mother, her white dress soaked with sweat, her cries fading as the poison coursed more quickly through her small frame. Mayor Shuto, stripped of all dignity, crawled toward the door, vomiting as his organs shut down. Dr. Thibodeau, blinded by pain, tried in vain to help the others, his voice breaking as he rasped to Moses. "Get help. Send for," before his words dissolved into silence. The dining room of opulence had become a chamber of horror candlelight, flickering over writhing bodies and overturned glasses. In the kitchen, Violet stood still, listening as screams and gasps spilled from the dining hall. Her face was calm, her body motionless, but tears streamed freely down her cheeks. They were not tears of guilt, but of release, like storm water after a long drought. Samuel found her there, rooted like stone. He had disobeyed her, stayed behind, unable to abandon her. Now, hearing the death throes echoing through the house, he understood the weight of her promise. His voice cracked as he reached for her, trembling with grief. "Violet," he whispered. Samuel's voice trembled as he whispered, "What have you done?" Violet turned to him, and for the briefest moment he glimpsed something familiar in her eyes, a flicker of the woman he had once loved. But it was only a shadow. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had endured unspeakable cruelty and been reshaped into an instrument of cold, relentless justice. Her answer came as a whisper, quiet as the last dying breath from the dining room. "I served them exactly what they deserved. Nothing more, nothing less." By midnight, the mansion stood in eerie silence. The laughter and clinking glasses of hours before had been replaced by the faint murmur of enslaved people praying in the servants' quarters and the steady scratch of Dr. Thibodeau's pen as he completed the death certificates. How he survived when so many had not remained a mystery, even to him. Perhaps his modest appetite had spared him, or perhaps his years as a physician, dosing himself with countless medicines, had built some hidden resistance. He could only wonder. The records filed in the Louisiana State Archives listed the cause as sudden fever of unknown origin. Thibodeau knew it was a lie, but the truth would only bring ruin and chaos. A mass poisoning at one of New Orleans' most prestigious gatherings would send shockwaves through the city, shatter reputations, and unleash scandal. More than that, Violet's brilliance had left no evidence to condemn her. Every substance she had used was natural, their effects indistinguishable from sudden illness by the standards of 1847 medicine. Autopsies could only conclude systemic organ failure, a death without culprit or clarity. The aftermath echoed through New Orleans for years. With the Bogard line extinguished, their plantation passed to creditors, carved apart and sold at auction. The mansion itself sat vacant for nearly a decade, its shutters closed, its windows black, whispered about as cursed. Eventually, it was purchased by a northern businessman who knew nothing of the horrors within its walls. The enslaved people of the household were scattered like ash. Families torn apart in estate sales, children separated from parents, husbands from wives. Moses and Thomas, valued for their skill, were sold to nearby plantations. Lily and others disappeared deeper into the brutal machinery of Louisiana's sugar empire, their fates unknown. Samuel, broken but alive, was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Within 2 years he was dead in accident, they said. But those who knew him believed otherwise. They said he had never recovered from that October night, that he had carried death inside him from the moment he watched Violet's vengeance unfold. As for Violet, she slipped from history's grasp. Some swore she was sold to an isolated parish, dying in obscurity within a few years. Others whispered that she escaped, finding freedom in the North, or even Canada. But the story most often told in the Creole quarters of New Orleans painted a different picture. They said she walked away from the Beauregard mansion that very night, vanishing into the labyrinth of the French Quarter. Under a new name, she cooked not for masters, but for the poor, her skill turned to feeding those who had nothing, seeking a quiet redemption in service. Dr. Thibodeau never spoke of what he had seen, but in the privacy of his journals, discovered by his descendants. A century later, he recorded the truth. He described the chaos, the poison, the screams, but also the extraordinary intelligence that had gone into every detail of Violet's plan. His entries revealed a conflicted admiration for her, even as he wrestled with the morality of her act. She was not a killer by nature, he wrote months after the tragedy. But she was made into one by the cruelty of others. And in the end, she became something more than a victim. She became justice itself. She was a woman reshaped by cruelty into something she never intended to become. Most would have broken long before reaching the point where Violet stood, yet she endured until her pain transformed into purpose. If guilt is to be placed, it cannot rest on her alone. It must be shared by all who upheld or ignored the system that forced her hand. When the Beauregard mansion was finally reoccupied in the late 1850s, its halls carried more than memories. Guests spoke of sudden illness during meals, servants whispered of strange smells in the kitchen, and cooks swore they saw the figure of a young black woman standing by the stove before dawn. These stories, fueled by rumors of the Beauregard family's true fate, gave the house a reputation as one of New Orleans' most haunted. Owners came and went quickly, none staying long before selling the cursed estate. During the Civil War, Union soldiers used the house as a garrison and later as a field hospital. Records tell of wounded men stricken by mysterious illnesses that baffled army doctors, as if the same shadow that claimed the Beauregards still lingered. In the 1880s, a historical society bought the property, intending to preserve it as an architectural relic. But accidents and strange setbacks forced them to abandon the effort. When the mansion was finally demolished in 1894, newspapers reported that the kitchen was found eerily intact, preserved as though time itself had spared it. The site eventually became a small park. Even today, locals tell of sudden sickness during gatherings, phantom scents of food in the air, and sightings of a woman in antebellum dress drifting through the early morning fog. Yet the most haunting legacy of Violet's story is not found in ghost tales, but in the reminder it leaves about cruelty and resistance. Slavery was built on the belief that human beings could be reduced to property, that their suffering could be ignored without consequence. Violet's story shatters that illusion. Her vengeance was born from a system that planted the seeds of its own destruction in the very cruelties it relied upon. The Beauregards were not monsters by their own reckoning. They were simply products of a world that normalized injustice. But by accepting and benefiting from that world, they sealed their fate. Violet's act was both inevitable and tragic. Inevitable because her suffering demanded release. Tragic because it corrupted a soul that once found joy in feeding others. A woman whose gift was nourishment became a figure who dealt only in destruction, not out of evil, but because every other path to dignity had been denied to her. The true ghost of the Bogard mansion was never Violet herself, but the collective guilt of a society that thrived on bondage. And perhaps that is why her story endures, because the most terrifying horrors are not supernatural. They are human, born of choices, systems, and the cruelty people justify as necessary. What do you think? Was Violet's revenge the only justice she could claim, or did she go too far? Could such a carefully orchestrated plan truly unfold as flawlessly as legend tells us? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this tale gripped you, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more explorations into the darkest corners of American history. Until next time, remember the past is never dead. Sometimes it isn't even past.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.